Hello, everyone, and welcome to the show. Tonight, my guest is Chamberlain, who's a lawyer and co-publisher of Human Events. Thank you so much for coming on.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to have you on because I feel like there's a major education gap in the conservative world right now about the vote certification process, about what the powers certain people had in our government were with it. So just to start off, what is the vote certification process that was happening within Congress recently?
So, we had on January 6th, we had a process where the Congress and the vice president certified the results of the Electoral College. And there were a lot of people saying that people like Vice President Biden or Congress themselves had serious, meaningful authority to reject the Electoral College votes, the certified Electoral College votes from the state. But a really basic reading of the constitutional text should disillusion anybody who had that idea in the first place. The 12th Amendment, I don't have it handy right in front of me, but it says something along the lines of the vice president shall open the the certified votes, and then the Congress shall certify. Congress has provided an opportunity to object, but it's not supposed to be done,
Right.
without a declaratory judgment from some court or something else that there's real proof of fraud. And I mean, in particular, people were saying Vice President Pence had the unilateral authority to reject certified electoral votes, and that never made any sense. If that were true in 2016, Joe Biden could have done that and made Hillary Clinton president. In 2000, Al Gore could have easily done that and made himself president, right? Al Gore barely lost the 2000 presidential election by one state. And if he had just said, you know what, Florida's electoral votes don't count, I win. And that's that. I mean, it could have been as easy as that. So yeah, never made any sense.
So when people were saying that Mike Pence wasn't doing his constitutional duty, were they giving him more power than what he really had? Because it seems to me like he's just somebody within the process, within the ceremony of Congress.
Yeah, I mean, so his role is there's actually a legal term for it. It's ministerial, right? Which means you don't have discretion. You don't have your job is to put a stamp on it, and you must put that stamp on it if the legal requirements are met. And that's what his job was. So, I mean, I saw things like that. There was like a memo that said #Pence card, that Pence has the unilateral authority to reject electoral votes. And it goes against, just really like 200 years of jurisprudence. I mean, the word shall is a piece of mandatory language. Like when you say an official shall do this, and that's a law, they have to, that's a requirement. It's, the distinction between you may do this and you shall do this is very important. And it happens in every statute imaginable. So it's just not real. I don't even think it's really that close a question. There isn't a court opinion on it because it's never gone to the Supreme Court or anything, but that doesn't mean that the text isn't clear.
And people who are saying that if more members of Congress, if the majority of the members of Congress voted against the certification, that somehow this would deliver the election to President Trump. Is that true from a legal standpoint?
I don't think so, but now you're getting into an area that I'm not quite as sure about the actual rules, like what happens if they actually get majorities. I think they have to, I don't know exactly what happens then, but I always knew that was never going to happen because the Democrats have a majority in the House.
Right.
So, and I do know that you need both a majority in the House and a majority in the Senate to sustain one of these objections under the statute, under the Electoral Count Act, which was never going to happen. So if Vice President Pence didn't have the unilateral authority to reject certified electoral votes, then no one was going to. And I mean, the problem was, it was like, and I'm actually kind of disappointed in a lot of ways. We can talk, it's sort of, the post-mortem of all what happened in the last 2 months. Mm-hmm. But I think a big issue was that people weren't playing straight with their constituents and a lot of members of the Trump base.
Right.
They were saying, oh, we're going to do something. It's going to work on January 6th. But they knew. They knew that these objections would ultimately be futile because it's right there in the act that you need a majority of both the House and Senate to sustain an objection. And the Democrats were never going to object to Joe Biden being president. Never mind that you're going to get a ton of Republican defections too.
Right. And that sort of brings me to my next question. There were many, many Trump legal challenges within the last couple months against this election, contesting it mainly in those closer states. What was the overall Trump legal strategy? We kept hearing wanted to get to the Supreme Court. We want to get it so that we have all these examinations of voter fraud. But was that the legal strategy?
I mean, I don't know that there was ever a very good one, right? I mean, they were faced with a problem. They needed, evidence of enough fraud and enough that identifiable votes that they could say these votes shouldn't be counted, they were illegitimate, and that number needed to be enough to put the election in question. At least that's the way it worked in Georgia, and that's probably the way it worked in a number of these other states. And they struggled to do that. And there were, I think there were two basic strategies going on in the Trump legal world, if not officially aligned with Trump, right? And I'm only going to be a little flippant about this, but it's basically true. There's the Giuliani strategy, which was only to allege things they could prove, which is in fact the much more legally appropriate strategy. But the problem was when you alleged everything they could prove, it didn't amount to anything that a judge could even grant relief based on. Like, a judge looks at what you can prove and is like, well, I can't overturn the election based on this, because even if you're right, it doesn't matter. And then there was the Sidney Powell strategy, not to be harsh, which was to allege things you couldn't prove, but that would overturn the election. That also didn't work because the judge looked at this and was like, these allegations are ridiculous, So we're sort of in this position where there was no real viable legal strategy. And that's not to say there was no fraud. And that's not even to say there was not so much fraud that it might have swayed the election. What it does say is what was provable in the aftermath of the election was not going to be enough to overturn it. Now, why was it, if there was fraud, why wouldn't it have been provable? Well, that's what voter integrity measures are for. Voter integrity measures don't just stop fraud, they also reveal it when it happens. That's the idea of, you have to show up in person and vote. So there's, all these pieces of evidence about you personally going to one place and then other people maybe see you vote somewhere else, or, any number of if fraud happens in a polling place, it's obvious, it's right there. Whereas with a mail-in voting, fraud is just not that hard. It's just not, if you want to do it. And that's not to say fraud on a mass scale is still pretty challenging, but lots of low-level fraud is possible in a world of mail-in voting. That's why France banned the practice a long time back.
I've seen a couple interviews since then of people, especially in the Nevada GOP, who were talking ahead of time with the Trump campaign about the amount of laws that were being changed by Democrats on state levels, about ballot harvesting, about what the standards for ballots were. Was that something that the Trump campaign seemed to be paying attention to, that the RNC was paying attention to, this massive effort nationwide?
I don't know if they weren't paying enough attention to it. And it shows also in kind of how the legal work happened after the election, right? You had this guy, Mark Elias, on the Democratic side. And Mark Elias, was one of the guys who actually, I think he retained Christopher Steele to write the Steele dossier. He's been very heavily politically involved. But his big project in the last year was opening up the voting laws and making fraud more easily detectable in the name of increasing voter access, right? But in reality, what that does is, it increases voter access for people who aren't citizens or who shouldn't be voting, and it increases the access of cheaters to the system, right? So we didn't have a Mark Elias on our own side. I don't know who the expert election lawyer is who is fighting all these cases, but as far as I could tell, he wasn't there, and we just got wrecked. We won a few cases in a few places, but overall lost the litigation before the election and then got absolutely steamrolled after the election. Our record was something like 1-60 in post-election litigation. And I think, I like Rudy Giuliani, but Rudy Giuliani is not an appellate litigator and he's not an election lawyer. Right. He's been out of the game for a long time, and they had him argue in front of the Third Circuit. And I'm not saying Rudy's a talented lawyer, but if we have an election law strategy that makes sense, we have a specialist, like a guy who does this and this alone for most of his, as a specialty, as a big part of his practice. And Rudy's never done it before. And people think every lawyer knows everything. It's no, not, the law is this unbelievably broad, massive expanse of, human activity. And it involves in every area. Patent law, criminal law, administrative law, just straight up commercial litigation. You can pick contract law. There's so many different areas of law, and they all, to really know and understand them well, you have to take time and practice in them for some amount, of people usually specialize to some degree. So for Rudy to be our rock star election lawyer was just really disappointing. And experienced lawyers saw that and were like, oh, we're going to lose. We're not going to beat the Democrats' election specialists with Rudy Giuliani as good a guy as he is.
And that's something I wondered about. The RNC has a huge amount of lawyers. We have many constitutional scholars who are conservatives, Republicans. Were the RNC lawyers involved in this process? Was the Justice Department involved in this process, or was it sort of a one-man show from the Trump campaign?
Well, I don't think the Justice Department is involved because they're not supposed to be like participating
Right.
in campaigns. I would think the RNC has its team involved, but I don't know how heavily they were actually running things. I don't know how many election lawyers stayed on staff, or if the normal outside counsel that would be brought in didn't come in. Because I know in prior elections, we've had election lawyers who are experienced. These people exist. The Republican Party's been around for 20 years.
Yeah.
Some of these people probably fought in the 2000 elections in Bush v. Gore. But they weren't here for this one. It didn't seem like it, or they certainly weren't given starring roles. And, I think that also manifested in the way that, and this is where I will criticize Rudy and I think Jenna Ellis too. There's a big difference between what the Trump legal team was telling the court versus what it was telling the public, right?
Okay.
It was telling the public, there's so much fraud, we're going to reveal it. And the decisions coming down against us are silencing this discussion of the fraud. But when they go into court, they wouldn't even allege fraud. They would just allege like, oh, some irregularities or poll watcher issues. Like that's different from saying the ballots were fraudulent. And like, I think that mismatch between the public statements and the statements under oath in court is just this huge problem, because it created this set of expectations among the conservative base that like, oh, we're going to get to overturn this. And if they were saying the same thing in public that they were saying in court, everybody would have kind of realized, oh, like we're probably not going to win this.
Right.
And I think, ultimately, I don't want to place a lot of blame on people for getting out of hand, but I don't think it was helpful for everybody to sort of blow up the hopes of continuing of winning this election between, maybe a few days in the aftermath when there were the shenanigans happening, but like by mid-November, late November, it was pretty clear, like, we're not going to win this, guys, right? The challenges are not working. The law is not there. The evidence is not what we need it to be. And once that's the case, like everybody should have been trying to get, lower expectations about what was possible rather than continuing to insist, no, we will prevail. It just needs to get to the Supreme Court. No.
And one of the things I wondered, because the expectations weren't meeting, was there anything during these Trump legal challenges that we could have gotten? Could we have gotten a better look at the laws that were changed beforehand? Could our priorities have shifted perhaps so that we could have seen other things we could have accomplished, getting back to a previous set of state election laws, getting rid of some practices that are really not helpful, things that we could have challenged legally that we didn't seem to be focusing on?
I think so. I think, for example, there's no reason the Georgia legislature needed to sit on its hands and accept, the legal challenge from Stacey Abrams's group.
Right.
I think we could have pushed harder against mail-in voting. I think we could have done any number of things to, prevent this. And I hope where we have control of the legislatures in these states, like hopefully they put that as priority one to change things back, to get rid of as much mail-in voting as possible. Like I'm of the belief that mail-in voting has such obvious potentials for fraud and coercion, right? You can, if you're in the same family, you can control someone else's ballot, force them, bully them into voting the way you want. And it is easy to, just literally mail out someone else's ballot if it comes to your address. And if, without them seeing it, or go around collecting ballots to all send in the same way. So, I really think mail-in voting is silly. I think if you want to vote in an election, the only reason you should be able to mail in vote is if you're incapacitated or overseas on military duty or something. Like otherwise, I like early voting. I think that, where you have to show up in person, but I don't think we should have any more mail-in voting except in rare circumstances.
And on the day of the election, I saw some of the things you shared about, poll watchers being kept out, being told you had to be a certain distance away. Those kinds of things, were those issues within the Trump legal challenges, were those things people were talking about when they went to court, or was it really, irregularities with a batch of ballots or a legal challenge?
They were talking about some of that. I know that was a big part of the PR strategy. And I filmed that video and Philadelphia has problems. In terms of complying with their own state's election law. Like I watched them, I observed them, I filmed them. I remember having some BuzzFeed journalists try and say I was spreading election and misinformation with that poll watcher video, but I wasn't. I had my law straight. This guy had a certificate to watch any poll in the city. And, the law's been different for 10 years from what the poll watchers were thinking. And they still were so arrogant. They just kicked him out and didn't even bother to read a poll certificate that said, you can watch anywhere. So, those were real, but it's like, what's the remedy for that? You have to, like, I think maybe you construct a law that provides more intense punishment for wrongfully kicking out poll watchers, that makes it clear that, like, look, you wrongfully kick out a poll watcher, that's a misdemeanor and a crime, like, period. And it's going to be
Right.
prosecuted. Like, don't do it. And so that in these trainings, people are told, like, let in the poll watchers. Like, just don't
It's
play
not worth
games with
it.
the poll watchers. It's not worth it, because we shouldn't be hearing about that stuff. This is America. We don't want, if we heard about stuff like that happening in foreign elections, we'd be like, that's a big problem. Your election integrity is weak. But was that enough? Like, did that make the basis of a legal challenge?
Yeah.
It's like, okay, like, individual poll watchers getting kicked out in a small part of Philadelphia, right? Like, it wasn't all over Philly, right? Like, it was in a particular ward where we had a number. There was, like, a number of issues with we heard early in the morning poll watchers were getting kicked out of places in, like, this one ward of the city, which is notorious for having a particularly corrupt city councilman, and so there's just there were some weird dynamics there. But that doesn't mean, like, the whole election in Pennsylvania was fraudulent, right? Like, it just means we had some problems, we had some shenanigans. We have those in a lot of elections. So I think to overturn it, they were always going to need a lot more than that. And I mean, if it was much closer in Pennsylvania, where it's like, oh, it's a 500 vote margin, what happened? And then we go to this ward in South Philly and say, what were you doing when there were no poll watchers there? Was that enough to swing the election? Should we, that's a more interesting question. But we lost by like 50 or 70, something like 50,000 votes in Pennsylvania. And that's not even, the whole population of that ward wouldn't be enough to make up for that.
Yeah. And now, we've lost the Senate. That's been called everywhere. We lost both seats in the Senate, one who'd actually won races before, and Loeffler. And a lot of the people who are upset about that, including me, we see a lot of issues with people believing that their vote wouldn't count in Georgia, that this would not really matter in Georgia. And one of the legal challenges was that the voting machines were corrupt, that the votes were changed overall. In your knowledge, was that ever proven in front of the court from the Trump campaign? Was that ever affirmed? Because if it was, it would make sense not to vote in Georgia. But if it wasn't, we just threw away the Senate then.
It was not proven, and it was just asserted in lawsuits, and the affidavits they based it on were unbelievably speculative. Like, it wasn't a flat out assertion this happened, but rather it could have happened, right? We have some technical guy who attests under oath that he says it could have been manipulated. Oh, it's okay, but, like, was it? Can you prove that? And you'd think that these companies would have some sort of measures to deal with that. And, like, I don't see the evidence of it. I mean, these affidavits were like, a different company's software was used 10 years ago to manipulate the election. I don't even think that's true, actually. I think that company announced that, they had ignored the results of the vote counting machines or something like that, and they created fraud on there independently of them. But I always thought it was just, there was no basis for it. You didn't have evidence of it. And you were just, I mean, it was a giant conspiracy theory that was really destructive.
Yes.
Because, it's one thing to say, well, there are shenanigans, there's a little ballot box stuffing going on in places, like low level shenanigans, because you can overwhelm that type of fraud with turnout. Like, whatever small level shenanigans, if you show up with 100,000 more people, you're going to win the election versus the low level fraud. But, like, if the voting machines are rigged, well, then they can just change the results anywhere. But if they could do that, if Democrats had the control to just radically change Dominion voting machines, we would have gotten crushed in the House. Oh, they could have just rigged the election to be in line with public polling before the election, which was, remember, we beat public polling by a lot. We were, I think, in general, Republican candidates beat it by like 5 or 6 points. You could rig an election to be in line with public polling and lead to a complete wipeout of the Republicans, and that didn't happen.
Right. And that's an important point, because we did okay in state legislatures. This was not a clean out of conservatism in this country.
Yeah.
And one of the things I think a lot of people have been questioning is, with the Trump campaign, with the legality of it, you're mentioning the team the Democrats had, who really seemed to have gotten beaten in PR strategy and legal strategy. Did we have any legal scholars on the Republican side that were really reaffirming this in the same way the left did? I would watch from the people the left had on, and these are people who were really laying out a legal case on television. Did we have that reciprocated on the right?
I think we had a few people, but I mean, the problem was, once the strategies that were chosen here, I mean, like, very quickly, people realized that everything had gone haywire. I mean, there were very talented lawyers like Harmeet Dillon. Yeah. But, like, Harmeet, like, at a certain point kind of looked like she sort of realized, like, the strategy that people are talking about, it won't work. It doesn't make sense. And I know, like, part of, I think, from a lot of people on our side was, there's a professional integrity aspect to this too. It's not just about like, oh, I want Trump to win. It's I have professional integrity as a lawyer, and my professional judgment is not going to be swayed by whatever people want. That's not to say I won't make any plausible legal argument
Right.
for my client or for our side, but I also will give objective analysis. And so, you could, a good solid lawyer was going to look at either, the Giuliani strategy or the Sidney Powell strategy, be like, those will not work. Those are not winning strategies. And like one is based on fantastical conspiracy theories that I can in good conscience support, and the other it just won't work. Like I can't. There's not a plausible argument under law as it's currently stated why that would be a justification to reverse the results of the election. So either way, if you're a good lawyer, you're just not going to adhere to those things out of sort of a basic professional ethic, and then. And then as a result, we don't have the talented lawyers out there defending the strategy, which is just not that defensible.
And for Georgia specifically, that seems to have been the hottest contested state throughout all of this. It's where people spent the most time, even without the Senate race. There was a lot of questions about the recounts, about if the Georgia politicians were doing the right thing. Do you think that most the politicians in charge of this, Governor Kemp, the people in the state legislature, were they following the law with the recounts? Because it seemed like conservatives were very disappointed by it. But should they have been?
I don't know. I mean, it's like hard. That's where we get really deep in the weeds, and I don't know that that's ever been fully explained. There are definitely things about the way that the Georgia officials behave that really struck me as sketchy. Like Raffensperger, struck me as a guy who had like a bone to pick with Republican senators and was perfectly happy to see David Perdue lose. This guy did not seem like he was on board, and was actually happy to see Trump lose. That said, did they actually screw up? It's not clear to me. I mean, we have all these assertions that they have, but then the assertions are being made by people who've gotten a lot of other stuff wrong too. And so I'd be reluctant to say affirmatively that Georgia was all screwed up without personally like really doing a deep dive into what was done. And yeah. I'm reluctant to do that.
And now that we're over this, I mean, Trump has said that there's a new administration coming in, the transfer of power is going to happen soon. Mm-hmm. Do you see efforts by Republicans to right the laws that were changed by Democrats in the run up to the election to right those things?
I think there's going to be a lot of energy for election integrity laws, even in the aftermath of all the craziness of this last week, because it's such a basic thing for Republicans to be able to win. We can't get cheated. We can't let, voter fraud is a big problem for us. And so we should be pushing serious election integrity. Get rid of vote by mail except in extreme circumstances. It's time for national voter ID. The arguments against voter ID to me are absurd. The amount of things you already need ID for to participate in modern society, the idea that you wouldn't want it to preserve election integrity, because, election integrity it's like one thing that this election proved, election integrity is not beyond question. And the integrity should be beyond question because that's an important guarantor of societal stability. Right. Like if people know that like the elections were real and nobody can really make an argument that they were fake, then that decision mechanism becomes the basis for like the losing part of our democracy to be like, accept the result. And with all this mail-in voting, with so much viable fraud, like the Republicans, even if like some got way out in front of their skis in terms of fraud, have reason to think like this wasn't fully on the up and up. And why should I accept it as legitimate? It's like Caesar's wife. Caesar's wife's loyalty and probity and fidelity should be beyond question, right? And similarly, election integrity should be beyond question. The fact that so many questions were capable of being asked without immediately a firm rebuttal is an indication something's wrong with our election system, and we need to change it to really, so it is obviously and demonstrably accurate and fair and impregnable.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people now are having those questions. It's sort of switching lanes from it to the legal PR strategy that we had in the last couple months. Do you think there was any PR strategy dealing with the legality of this that would have been effective in creating more change and getting more people energized, or even getting more people ready to fight for the legal challenges for the midterms? Or was it just hopeless?
Right. I think ultimately it was going to have to come down to, basically the Trump campaign and Trump himself should have been aggressive at shutting down the election rigging machines arguments, right? Like, because that was an argument that was going to suppress your own turnout. If we were going to sit there and say Republicans, some large number of Republicans believe that the voting machines are rigged, we have just suppressed our own turnouts because Democrats don't believe that. And really that's what happened in Georgia. Like if you look at what happened,
Yeah.
that was a turnout election.
Mhm.
Democrats turned out their base. We didn't. We lost way more turnout in red areas than they lost in blue areas. So that's why we lost the Senate. So we really needed to get out in front of anything that was going to be a turnout suppressing argument. Those needed to be off the table entirely. Even if they were true, they need to be off the table because we still needed to turn out our voters. And then just focus on like the message is there was a lot of shenanigans. If we're going to overcome those shenanigans, you need to show up. Okay, that could have worked and made sure that we didn't lose the Senate and made sure that we and given us the best position to credibly pose challenges. Because another big problem is if you're going to ask a judge to reverse an election, you need to maintain your overall credibility. And with all the crazy lawsuits that were being filed everywhere on preposterous theories, like the entire effort got tinged with this like lack of credibility and made it really easy for federal judges to just be like, nah, I don't want to do this.
Right. Yeah. And I think that that's something people have to realize is how out of the box we got in this. Just sort of in closing, we've discussed the Trump legal strategy, the PR strategy, and I've sat here and I've wondered, because Trump is not a lawyer, who was really the driving force of this? Who was making the PR decisions and the legal strategy? Who was in charge of all of this?
I don't know. I do not know. And the funny thing is, you say that I'm coming to a conclusion that our next president should have a law degree. The next Republican nominee should have a law degree. And we always make fun of lawyers, whatever, but we're in this very combative partisan environment. And so much of what went wrong in the first 4 years was attributable to Trump himself not fully having a grasp on the extent of his powers, right? What could he do? What couldn't he do? And that way, Obama was much more effective at pursuing Democrat policy goals because he was a law professor. He knows where he can't go. Mm-hmm. He knows where he can push things and make the law bend in his favor. And then he knows where he obviously has the right to go. And obviously is just going to be able to exercise his authority. That it's if the presidency is the control of the executive branch, this massive apparatus of our government, million or two employees, the biggest institution in the country, a lawyer is going to come in and understand the cockpit, right? And understand what all the buttons do and what buttons he can press and what buttons he needs to not press. Whereas Trump came in and just was even as somebody is good at business and negotiating, so he was able to handle some big aspects of the presidency well, when it came to what do I have the legal authority to do? What do I not? Right. He was always, very uncomfortable. And then also he became very reluctant to exercise his power because he didn't know when he would go too far.
Yeah. And I think that's an important argument that hasn't been talked enough about. Thank you so much for coming on. Where can people follow you and follow Human Events?
All right. So Will Chamberlain on Twitter and Human Events on Twitter. Both of those, the name is should be in the bottom left corner right now, just that in one syllable. Also, we're trying to build up other accounts. We live stream every day on Twitter, or Monday through Friday on Twitter, YouTube, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook. So you can find Human Events on Facebook as well, and also on YouTube. So Human Events at either place.
Perfect. And we'll make sure to link that below. Thank you so much for coming on.
All right. Thanks so much.